Good morning. Glad to see everybody here this morning. We're studying in 1 Corinthians, and we're going to finish up the 8th chapter today and go into the ninth chapter. If you'll remember last week, we were discussing eating the meat that was sacrificed to idols and the problems that this was causing for some of the weaker members of the church. And we were discussing verse 10, which we'll kind of start here and tie the rest of the few verses in that we've been talking about. But this was an issue that Paul had been asked about, and obviously he considered it a strong enough problem that he devoted pretty much a whole chapter to it here to impress upon the fact that the things that we do have an influence on others, and we need to be careful about the things that we do that may not be a problem for us and may not be a problem scripturally, but may be a problem for a weaker brother that would cause them to stumble. So before we go any further, I'd like for Philip, if you would, lead our minds in prayer.
Father, thank you for the days you blessed us with, for the night prayers. We thank you, Father, for the opportunity to gather once again as your children, and we can study your word. We pray, Father, for all those who are less fortunate to not be with us today because of sickness. We pray also, Father, for those who are spiritually sick, that are just not with us because they do not want to be. Father, go with us, watch over us, with us through this class. Forgive us the wrong we do. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay, let's briefly look at verse 10. It says, "For if a man seeth thee who hath knowledge sitting at meat in an idol's temple, will not his conscience, if he is weak, be embroidered to eat things sacrificed to idols?" So, what we were talking about here was the weaker one seeing another one of the members of the church there sitting at either in the temple, or as we discussed last week, there was probably kind of like a little area outside the temple where these feasts were done, and it could have been in that temple, or it could be in some area around the temple. And a very good point was made last week about what were they doing in there to begin with, and it was a real issue then. And like we discussed last week, there was a lot of temples to different false gods that were there in Corinth, and this was a common situation, and these people had grown up in this and knew all about it, and some of the weaker brothers were really having a problem with this. So now let's move on to verse 11. It says, "For though thy knowledge he hath that is weak perishes, the brother for whom Christ died." So, Paul's telling him here, he's talking here about, people, they have the knowledge. They know that this is not a problem, but really they're kind of abusing that knowledge that they have, and they're not considering the weaker members. And because of their actions, they're using their knowledge in a way to cause some of the other members to that are weaker to perish. And this is a bad situation. These are the same brothers and sisters that Christ died for, and the actions of some were causing them to fall away. So the lesson here is we need to be accountable for the things that we do, that there may on the surface be nothing wrong with it, and scripturally there be nothing wrong with it, but we know that it's a problem for somebody else, and because of our arrogance or whatever it would be, we go ahead and do it and not consider the feelings of the other weaker brethren. And what it does, it proves and runs them to ruin. So kind of Paul speaking more fully on this subject. If one of them that believeth not biddeth you to a feast, and ye disposed to go whatsoever is set before you, eat, asking no questions for conscience sake. we need to be thinking about these things. Are what we doing causing a problem for somebody else? And we need to not only think of ourselves, but we need to think of the brethren or somebody that may see us there. And even though it would be lawful for us to partake of it, we need to consider it. It's not just eating. Of course, we don't usually eat stuff that's sacrificed to idols anymore, but it could be anything that we would do in our lives that there might not be a real problem with, but to somebody else it's a stumbling block, and we need to give consideration to that, and don't put ourselves in a situation where our actions could cause some other brother or sister to stumble. And like we said last week, this was not only a problem for the Greeks or the Gentiles there in Corinth who had grown up doing this, but this was also a problem for the Jews that were in the church too. If you'll remember last week, we talked about the different sects of Jews that were in the church there also. So it was not just a problem that Paul was addressing for the Gentiles. It was also a problem for some of the former Jews that were there in the church. So we need to be very careful, in the things that we do, that we don't lead others into sin. Comments about that verse, Kevin?
There's a fine line to that as well. I know it's been several years ago. I was buying communion supplies, and I couldn't find the bread that we typically use, so I bought some of the real little teeny squares.
I remember those things.
Well, the very first time we used them, I got the comment right after that. Well, I don't like that. How can we break bread if I got that little teeny square? So the person made a comment I respected very much, and so I did away with it. We went back to the regular bread that we typically use. But especially the elders, we can't always cave to the weak.
That's right.
And if we try to make a decision, if we went with, well, I don't like the way you're doing this, or I don't like that, or we would get nothing done.
Right.
There would be nothing. So there's a fine line there for that.
And I remember when that happened. It sounded like we only used them one time.
Yeah, exactly.
and we were up here. Matter of fact, I was teaching class, and there was another one of our members thought that was the greatest thing because it was a sanity. I mean, you can't win for losing in a situation like and.
David, I always wondered that. So the bread, when you prepare the communion, you're breaking them. So what is the difference? So I just always got confused with we have it, worth it. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I can remember at one congregation that I used to attend. If you were in charge of the table, the whole square was all together on the top, and you actually had to sit and break it into however many trays you had. That's how many pieces you broke it into. Same situation.
We're putting too much emphasis on breaking the bread.
Right. I mean, it's kind of like the deal with one cup. It's kind of a similar.
Yeah, really, I think the idea of breaking the bread is just basically the idea of. We still use the term today, but that's an idea of having a meal. Right. Breaking bread.
Right. And we don't have the same situation that Christ had back then. The way that the leavened bread and everything was prepared was a little bit different back then. And they were actually having a meal when the Lord's Supper was instituted. So I mean, but you're right. When you get to be when you make the big bucks as the leader, then that's some of the things that you have to deal with it, and everybody has to kind of step back sometimes and think about what the decision is. That's right, lonely at the top. All right, let's look at verse 12. And thus sinning against the brethren and wounding their conscience when it is weak, ye sin against Christ. So that's a pretty serious charge there. If we're doing something that causes a wounding of the conscience of somebody who is weaker than we are, then that's the same as committing a sin. And it's a serious situation. And you can't emphasize enough thinking about the conscience of other people and being considerate of the things that things that we do. And I mean, this was even a situation that that Christ addressed back in Matthew 25 and verse 40. He says, "Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye did unto one of these my brethren, even the least, ye did it unto me." So Christ understood the importance of how we treat each other, and I think in a lot of ways, we're judged on how we treat people who are that don't have it as good as we have, or in a lesser situation that we have. I mean, there's people that's got fantastic degrees from the best colleges around, and they walk around and they look down on everybody that doesn't have something along their line, and they look down on people based on the jobs that they do, or how they live and stuff like that. And that's not a good thing, and it's a matter of respect. So here in Matthew, Christ is kind of personifying himself as a poor brethren, and being on the same level as the lowest, and that's how we kind of need to think. So here Paul tells us that he who causes another brother to stumble, sins against Christ. So let's look at verse 13. "Wherefore, if meat causes my brother to stumble, I will eat no flesh forevermore, that I cause not my brother to stumble." So here Paul's summing it up, and this is kind of what we refer to as leadership by example. He is going to set the example to the people there at Corinth, that even though he's free to do this, and we're going to kind of talk about this a little bit more in the next chapter. He is going to look at his own welfare and his own good, and he will kind of step back and maybe put himself in a lesser situation, just so that he won't tempt or cause a problem for some of the weaker brethren. And he's conscious of this, all the time. And so, if our conscience is ruled by the conscience of our weak brother, in all relations of life, we should act on this principle and seek the good of others as we seek our own good. Consider, the other person. And I know that, one of the things that in many of the leadership classes that I've taken over the years, they emphasize, taking care of your people and making sure that, you're attending to their needs and putting their needs in front of your needs. And, it's just a small thing that we do to show respect for other people. And I always think about when I was in high school, I went to Ohio State University for athletic trainer school. And of course, that was when Woody Hayes was the football coach at Ohio State. And we went to the athletic training facility that they had. I mean, it was just absolutely unbelievable, as you could imagine. And every morning we would come in, we would see this old guy in there. And he was kind of tall, and he looked like somebody took him out and whaled the tar out of him all the time. And he had this great big scar on his neck. I mean, he was kind of a daunting type of guy. And when he talked, he just kind of grumbled because he'd had surgery on his throat and stuff. And somebody asked the question, what does this guy do? And he said, well, he's the equipment manager. And he's the guy who makes all the special braces and stuff for the football players when they get injured and stuff like that. And one of the things that they mentioned, they said, you know what? Every morning when Woody Hayes comes in, he goes and gets a cup of coffee for that guy, and they sit and have coffee together. Now, that made an impression on me, because here's a guy like Woody Hayes that in his time, and even still today, is a football coaching legend. He didn't have to do that, but he did, because he respected the job that guy. And nobody knew who this guy was. If you start talking about the legends of Ohio State football, this guy's name would never come up. But yet, Woody, did that for this guy every morning. There's an example, and like I say, I always thought about that, about treating other people, and being when I was a fire chief and different situations where I've been the leader. I always try to make sure that some of the people that don't get the recognition that they deserve, you sit down and you spend a little bit of time with them, and it goes a long way to building a team and esprit de corps and things along this line. And that's what Paul is talking about here. Comments or questions about that chapter?
I think we need to be careful not to offend like a weaker brother. But also, that weaker brother needs to learn as mature.
Absolutely.
Or he won't be offended.
Right.
By certain things that is not good or bad. It's not illegal to do those things, and he has to grow to realize.
Right. And I think that the leader needs to to point that thing out to him also, and that's one of the reasons that you get him to you show him how to grow is you sit down and you spend the time with him to do that. Any other comments about that chapter?
I don't know if it was raining, but I wrote something down here years ago that said, people don't care how much you know,
Right.
instead of all their degrees, but they just want to know how much you care about them.
Right.
So that was something that, I think it was something that someone many years said, I wrote that down, but something that.
Yeah, I heard a quote here along that same line here, and I can't remember where it was here just recently. People don't remember what people remember is how you treated them. And that's kind of one of the important things there. Other comments about that chapter? All right, let's move into the 9th chapter. The first thing I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about scholarship and ancient manuscripts. I've looked at actually 5 different translations of this first verse. Okay, and Clark had some very interesting comments about the construction of this first verse, and his comment was that the King James Version switched around how this verse was actually written in some of the very old ancient texts, the Syriac, the Ethiopic, the Vulgate, the Alexandrian Cortex, that I am free was first and I am an apostle was second. And I was looking at some of the different translations. An American Standard Version, it says, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? The King James Version says, am I not an apostle? Am I not free? The modern King James Version has it the same way. The Revised Standard Version has it, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? And, there was several discussions among the scholars to how this particular verse was constructed in the King James Version. It really doesn't have a whole lot to do with what the meaning was here, but it does affect a little bit to how much this ties in to what was talked about in chapter 8 versus what's talked about in chapter 9, because we're going to spend some time here in chapter 9 talking about support for the apostles, which kind of comes down to support for anyone who's preaching the gospel. So kind of keep that in mind as we go through. So let's look at verse 1, and I'm reading from the King James Version here, okay? Or actually, I'm reading from the Revised Standard Version.
It also says free over apostle.
Free over apostle, okay. All right, so it says, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are not ye my work in the Lord? So he had just said that those that had knowledge should be ready to surrender their rights for the good of the weak. And he now shows them that in matters which affect the whole life, he had himself governed himself by this rule, that he's not going to put himself in a position to do anything that's going to cause a weaker brother to stumble, even though he was free to do that. He had the right to do that as an apostle, but he wasn't going to do that. And that's kind of the theme that he's starting to talk about in this particular chapter. He was free, and he could have claimed that those to whom he preached should support him, but he deemed it wise to waive that right, and in doing so, he subjected himself to a greater hardship than what he could have. And what we've got to remember here is that we know from Acts that when Paul went to Corinth, he worked with these people, and I'm not talking about talking to them. I'm talking about he worked with them. He was out there in the fields laboring with them, pretty much paying his own way to do the things that he was doing, and that put additional stress on him having to do these things. So he basically didn't ask for or possibly even refused any help that the church at Corinth was going to give him to support him in the work. He was basically paying his own ways. So he said, I'm an apostle, and he was entitled to that. But just because you're entitled to it doesn't necessarily make it right for you to take it. Now we know from the Old Testament that the prophets were divinely commissioned, and they had a right to have their physical needs supported. Same deal with the apostles. They had the right, because of their position, to have their physical needs supported. But Paul was basically waiving that right to not cause any problem. So all of these questions here are designed to basically answer in the affirmative. Yes, he is an apostle. Yes, he is free. He possesses all the rights and privileges that an apostle had. And we have to remember that Paul got his commission directly from Jesus, and Jesus revealed to him all of these things and how he wanted Paul to go about and preach the gospel. Now, it kind of maybe gives the impression here that there were some that may have questioned his authority as an apostle. Because if you'll remember back at the beginning of this book, they had a lot of different sects in the church based on who baptized them, and they kind of looked to individual people that they considered to be the leader, and there maybe have been some in that church that didn't completely believe or question Paul's authority as an apostle. Because if you'll remember, of the apostles that were there, Paul was kind of the one that was born out of season. He wasn't in that original group. Jesus came to him on the road to Damascus and picked him out and made him an apostle, and he wasn't in the in the original group there. So we know that from the story in Acts and the writings in Acts that Paul was converted directly by Jesus, and he met all of the requirements that were necessary to be an apostle, and so his authority was pretty much unquestioned. Comments about that verse?
Like you said, he was very influential in the Church of Corinth. He spent a year and a half there.
They knew him.
Yeah, so he basically built it from ground up.
Right.
So like you said, he's being questioned on his apostleship, his authority. In verse 1, he's addressing the church there in verse 1. He said, "And are you not my work in the Lord?" He's addressing the
Right.
It's part of his letter, obviously. That you is the Church of Corinth.
Right.
Are you not my work? Have I not worked? Have I not built you up? Have I not strengthened this congregation? Have I not put it together from the ground, basically?
Absolutely.
In the second letter, he speaks about the same thing. He says, "You are my epistle, and the world sees and hears you."
Right.
So when they go out in the world, they are actually going out into Paul as his teaching.
Right. And you think about that. That's a pretty big responsibility, to have. And it's not just a church in Corinth. You think of all the churches that Paul established, and when you establish something, you feel responsible for it, and you want it to grow, and you want it to prosper, and that's a lot of weight on your shoulders sometimes to keep all the kids kind of in the fold there. So.
Isn't it because of my work that you belong to the Lord?
What translation you got?
Well, there's 4 of us, but this one's New Living.
Okay. And that's a good way to put. I think the New Living is a paraphrase type Bible instead of a literal translation. Very good. Okay, let's look at verse 2. If to others I am not an apostle, yet at least I am to you, for the seal of mine apostleship are on ye in the Lord. So there are people out there that he knew that they know that I'm not an apostle. Okay, and it may be in some other church somewhere, but they're in Corinth. There's no question about it, because his seal, his work is there. They're the product of his labor in the Lord there in Corinth. And those people should not, they need to keep that in mind. Others may reject him. Some of the other churches that were established by some of the other apostles may not, recognize Paul as an apostle because he wasn't one of the original ones. But right there at Corinth, there was no question about it. Like Kevin pointed out, he was there in the beginning. He worked with them, and they knew him by name and by face and by everything else.
They are his teaching handiwork.
Right.
They basically stand out as to his doctrine, his teaching, and although we know that they were pretty inconsistent in the way they lived,
right,
what he taught them should be stamped on their hearts.
Right. And this was said here in kind of in a way of supposition, not of concession. He's not conceding that that he's not an apostle. And if you think about it, Paul was picked out for a special mission. And the mission that he was given was to be the apostle for the Gentiles, which was kind of a different mission than Peter had. Peter was more considered to be the apostle for the Jews, and they were doing the same work, but they had a different way of doing the same work, and who they were actually called to to concentrate on doing. And that's not to say that there weren't Jews in the church at Corinth that were Christians. There were. There's record of that. But Paul's purpose and his main mission was to be the apostle for the Gentiles. Now, some of the other churches may have been founded by Peter and had a very heavy Jewish concentration versus Gentile concentration. But in either case, even though that they had a little bit different mission, the objective was the same. And this was not a problem for the other apostles. They considered Paul to be an apostle also. So there was no division among the apostles. And now that's not to say that there wasn't some disagreements every now and then, because there were. But I don't think that we can show anywhere where the apostles rejected Paul as a full apostle. So the church there at Corinth was the seal, and like Bill said, it was stamped on their heart, and him being the instrument to make that happen was pretty much indisputable, because they had the characteristics and they had the teachings that Paul had had given them, even though they kind of strayed off the path a little bit. The basis was there, and it's not to say that every now and then, we do kind of, wander off the reservation every now and then. You kind of have to be brought back in. That's just kind of, human nature sometime. And Paul's concern for the church of Corinth was evident. Not only did he write one letter to them, he wrote 2 letters to them. So, I mean, he really was, concerned about, what was going on. So let's look at verse 3. My defense to them that examine me is this. So he's now going to talk about his defense of his church there and his apostleship. And if there was any, opponents there about his apostleship, he was going to lay it out pretty clearly that, he had the qualifications that were necessary to be an elder, in addition to, all the labor that he had done there at the Corinth. So this answer that he has satisfied Peter and James and John, who gave him the right hand of fellowship, seeing that he had been committed to the apostleship of the Gentiles. And we can read about this in Galatians 2, 8 and 9. It says, for he that wrought effectually in Peter to the apostleship of the circumcision, the same was mighty and in me toward the Gentiles. And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given unto me, they gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go to the heathen, and they unto thee. So basically, there was no problem there with what was going on, and he is getting ready now to go into a dissertation here about support and things that the apostle needs to, or the apostles need to, know, and they need to know about the work there. Comments about that verse, not a whole lot there. All right, let's look at verses 4, 5, and 6. Have we no right to eat and to drink? Have we no right to lead about a wife that is a believer, even as the rest of the apostles and the brethren of the Lord and Cephas? Or only I and Barnabas, we have not a right to forbear working? So now he's starting to talk about and make the comparison of the rights that he has, and then we're going to kind of go into him not using that. So he obviously he had a right to eat or drink. He had a right to eat or drink the stuff that was the stuff that was left over from the sacrifice. He had that right. Just because he was an apostle, he didn't forego that. He also had the right to have a wife, and we know from the scriptures that at least Peter was married. He had a mother-in-law. That's pretty good evidence that that you're married. You have a mother-in-law, and but Paul and Barnabas, they that's who he was talking about here. He's starting to prove now that he has these rights, and apparently these things were being called into question. But he had that right, and all these things could be answered in the affirmative. That yes, he has that right, just as the rest of the brethren had that right to do it. Also, he also has the right to have. Jesus had brothers and sisters, or at least brothers we know of, that that was just that was just part of the deal. So they're trying to nitpick here, and he's just saying, look, it's not that way. Some have endeavored to prove that they were they didn't have this right because Paul wasn't married, and he gave a dissertation already about that, and that was his choice. He had the right to be married, but that was his choice because in his heart he felt like that having a wife might be a burden and might interfere with the mission that he had as being the apostles to the Gentiles.
Well, I don't want to get ahead of it because I know you're going to bring this out in the next few verses, but this whole point that he's trying to make is he has the right to travel around, to go to these various churches, to bring along his companion, his spouse if he has one, just like the other apostles, and they have the right to be supported.
Absolutely.
By the church.
Absolutely.
That's
where he's going with this.
And even today, it's amazing. There's not a lot that I've heard of it. There are some even today that doesn't feel like that we should actually have a paid preacher. But there are a lot in the brotherhood that are, and that goes back to the previous chapter about the weaker brethren.
Right. Yeah, I mean.
It's all intermingled, intertwined, however you want to say it.
Right, and I mean I don't know, and you're right. We're going to get into it probably not this week, but next week. I mean, he's pretty strong about this, and I mean, he put himself in a position at the very beginning to be able to speak to this without any prejudice because he didn't ask for any support. He worked with them the whole time, and he didn't cost them one red cent. He actually probably contributed more to them than what he needed for support himself, Bill.
Although he did work to support himself. 1 Thessalonians 2:9, he talks about the fact, for you remember, brethren, our labor and toil, for laboring night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. We preach to you the gospel of Christ. Yeah, we preach, but we also work.
Right.
We support ourselves.
And this was, we're going to see this later on too. This was a matter of conscience for him. I mean, he made a conscious decision that this was what he was going to do. And really, if you think about it, it was a very wise decision because they couldn't come back and say, well, he's just doing this, to make money and, to live off of us. And, these people didn't have a lot to live off of anyway. So like Bill said, he wasn't a burden to anybody. And that just strengthened his position there. So I think we'll stop right there. I've got 20 till. So we'll stop there and pick up next week. I appreciate all the good discussion today.